Hello dear lovely listeners, welcome again to EcoLead. As usual, today we'll be touching on something very interesting. Now, I don't know if you've heard of forever chemicals, PFAS, PFOS, P4, Genex. This group of chemicals have been making the news headlines across the world for all the wrong reasons. Chemicals used in making non-stick cookwares, dust-proof surface cleaners, water-resistant clothing materials, cosmetics, and these chemicals are finding their way into our body through various means and are causing serious health concerns. Despite the interest in this chemical, I believe there are more questions than answers, which is why I have sat down today with an expert, Dr. Daniel Drage, who is an associate professor at the University of Birmingham, to help us answer some of these questions. Dr. Dan has a broad range of experience investigating the presence and effects of emerging and legacy environmental organic contaminants, including persistent organic pollutants such as PFAS. He investigates these contaminants in humans and in various environmental compartments. He's currently the program lead for MSc Environmental Health and MSc Public and Environmental Health Sciences at the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Birmingham. We sat down and touched on a broad range of areas, from trying to understand the basics of PFAS, the basics definition, what PFAS is and all the other basic things about PFAS, to how we as individuals can protect ourselves and our loved ones from these chemicals. We also touched on something very important. Now, you may have heard, as a breastfeeding mother or someone who is close to a breastfeeding mom, that these chemicals can actually get to our infants through breastfeeding, and you might be a bit worried about that. So please stick around and let's enjoy this conversation. Thank you for agreeing to come on the show. I'm sure you have a lot to tell my audience, and we're more than happy to have you on. So, just like a brief background, how did you eventually arrive at this environmental space where you do this great work you're currently doing?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one, actually. I finished school and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I've always been very scientific, but I found the straightforward hard sciences, they didn't motivate me on their own, so I wanted to do something more applied. Okay. And then I ended up coming to the University of Birmingham to study environmental science as an undergraduate student. And in second and third year of that, I attended some lectures delivered by Professor Stuart Harrod.
Oh, okay. I know him.
Yeah. On environmental pollution and environmental protection. And I just found them really inspiring because it was that link between humans and the environment and how our own activity and pollution can impact us, not just on the environment but also on our own actual health. And I stayed on, did a PhD in environmental chemistry.
The PhD was in Birmingham?
A PhD was in Birmingham with Stuart Harrod as well.
That's an interesting Birmingham experience.
Yeah.
So, bachelor's, Birmingham, masters?
Didn't do a master's.
You didn't do a master's, straight to PhD. Again, all in Birmingham,
Yeah. And then after that went to Australia to the University of Queensland.
I saw something. I was going to ask the Australian part of your. While I was looking up your previous work, I saw something about Queensland. Is it Queensland?
Yeah, University of Queensland. Yes, so it used to be called the National Research Centre for Environmental Toxicology. So that's what it was called when I was there. It's now, just as I was leaving, they were changing over to the Queensland Alliance of Environmental Health.
Okay.
And they are hosted at the University of Queensland and joint with Queensland Health, which is Queensland government funded organisation.
I see.
I worked there for nearly 3 years, and travelled back here to work at Birmingham again.
Yeah. Interesting. And what's your working in Australia and here, how would you compare your experience in those two spaces without offending Australians?
It's a very different lifestyle. I mean, it's very sunny, very warm.
Okay.
You're always 2 hours away from the best beaches in the world.
Interesting.
So which is great.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of working life, I mean, the setup, the labs, the type of work we were doing was very similar. And I was often in touch with people at Birmingham. There were often people going each way visiting as well. So very, very similar.
I see. All right. So back in Birmingham now, what kind of research were you actually involved in? What kind of questions have you been interested in answering all over in the past couple of years?
So in general, my interest would be harmful chemicals or chemicals that we're exposed to that are harmful to human health and more widely in the environment. And I've particularly focused on persistent organic pollutants within that.
So when you say persistent organic pollutants, because one of the things we do here is just to help people really understand the hard work that you do.
Yeah.
And so when you say persistent organic pollutants, what exactly, can you break that down a bit? What exactly?
So there are criteria to become or to be known as a persistent organic pollutant. So essentially, what I would consider is that it's got some form of carbon in it. That makes it organic.
Yeah.
It's anthropogenic, so it's man-made.
Yep.
And it's what we would call persistent in the environment. So it's very difficult to break down. So it hangs around in the environment and builds up. So it bioaccumulates. So the environment or wildlife or people cannot get rid of these chemicals as quickly as they're put in, and then they last for a very long time. So we're talking tens, hundreds of years in the environment before they disappear.
Yeah. So when you say the environment cannot get rid of it easily, you're talking about the natural system that ordinarily
natural processes.
takes care, natural processes.
So either we're talking maybe UV, sun degradation, or microbial activity, or metabolism within the body or of animals and wildlife. Actually, the physical and biological processes that happen to break things down.
Yeah, and it's that would come down basically to the chemistry of the particular pollutants we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. And so that would quickly just make us move into, because that's what they say mostly about PFAS, right? They say forever chemicals.
Yes.
So and I'm sure you've done some work on PFAS, haven't you?
Yeah, so PFAS is one group of persistent organic pollutants, and they are very prominent in the media at the moment.
So what exactly makes them that? Because I mean, I've been hearing about persistent organic pollutants, especially because you know my area of research.
Yeah.
But what exactly makes PFAS stand out the way it does? Because I mean, every conversation now is about PFAS. What exactly makes it that?
Well, they don't conform to the traditional POPs, persistent organic pollutants, that we normally look at. So normally POPs have very distinct properties. They are lipophilic, so they are found in fatty tissues, and they are water repellent, hydrophobic.
Yeah.
PFAS are a little bit different. So they seem to have this lipophilic oil repellent property, but they're also water repellent at the same time, and can also be water soluble at the same time as being water repellent. So they're very odd, and they're very difficult to predict or understand how they're going to behave. When we find them in our bodies, we don't necessarily find them in the same way. So in persistent organic pollutants, because they prefer the fat, we find them in the fatty tissues in our body, and that's how they reach equilibrium. Whereas the PFAS, they like to bind to proteins, and so we look for them in different ways and find them in different ways in the blood. So we would measure them in a different unit, for example, because of the way they behave. So they're very different, and they've got this unique carbon-fluorine bond, which is considered the strongest natural chemical bond, which is what makes them so hard to break down in the first place, and it also gives them a lot of these unique properties. So they're resistant to thermal degradation, they're water repellent, they're oil repellent. So it gives them a whole range of properties that can be used in a huge number of applications.
Yeah, so it's those applications that then make them widely available in environmental metrics and all of that, isn't it? Yeah, so I've noticed you did some work on PFAS and textiles. Could you elaborate on that a bit? What was that particular work about?
So PFAS, they've got a couple of applications in textiles really. So there's stain proofing is one of them. So if you've ever had your carpets or your car treated to have it stain proofed, so things like Scotchguard.
When you say stain proof, I think dust proofing, those things they use on dashboards ahead is reaching PFAS too?
Yes, as well. So there'll be various treatments you can have to your textiles and other things which will prevent them staining, so they're easily wiped off. So if you spill something, you can wipe it off easily. Those treatments will often contain at least one PFAS chemical.
Yeah, so sorry, now that you've actually mentioned one, there's this thing about there being over 10,000 or 15,000 different PFAS, isn't it?
Yes, so it depends on the definition, and there are a number of definitions of PFAS.
Okay.
The most widely accepted definition now that we're trying to use, and that's more to have consistency in the field, is the OECD definition, which means that it just has to have a CF2 bond. So 2 fluorines to a carbon.
Okay, thank you. I was going to ask what you mean by CF2.
So that's this strong CF bond.
What you said is good already. You say it.
2 fluorines attached to 1 carbon within the whole compound.
Okay.
Right, but what that means is by that definition, we're up to around 15,000 different PFAS chemicals, which is huge, and it's what makes it so challenging.
So when you say 15,000, I don't think we're currently monitoring up to 5, or are we in the range of 5 to 10? And when I say we, I'm talking specifically about the UK, for example.
5 to 10,000 or 5 to 10?
Number.
No. So yes, there's probably in general people are, I mean, even if we look at all the ones we're able to look at, 40 to 50, you know, that we can measure quite comfortably, you still got nearly 15,000 left at the end of it. The UK, I would expect monitors more than we know about and that is published, but the real prominent ones in the environment,
PFAS,
PFOA, there's a few others. I won't go through all the acronyms, but there's probably 6 or 7 that are really well known.
Okay.
And then others.
Yep. And so that means we have over 10,000 to go.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you've just mentioned stain repellent stuffs and all of that. What other daily, everyday things that we use can expose us to PFAS?
Okay. So there's a lot. So there's waterproofing. So outdoor gear, tents, sleeping bags, waterproof jackets, gloves, like the Gore-Tex type gloves. They will usually or have previously had some form of PFAS in. The big one in your homes will be probably your non-stick pans. So you cook with them, and that's a big source because then the PFAS can migrate out of those pans and into the food that you're actually cooking in there, and then that's a direct source of exposure. And then if it makes it into water, because again we can't tell if we are efficiently removing all of them, so it's possible that some of them might end up in our drinking water also, and people who go swimming, that's also another pathway of exposure. I think the UK is behind in looking at drinking water?
It depends on where you're looking at. If you say it's behind, I'm sure you're comparing the UK to countries like the US.
So compared to the EU and the US, yes, we are.
If we start comparing it to Nigeria or
no, of course, that's true.
Yeah.
So we're not at the back. But we're behind the front runners in terms of monitoring drinking water. But I think if you look at drinking water in the US, for example, where they've got a pretty good idea, at least for a number of PFAS of what's in there, they regularly find several PFAS in drinking water at various levels.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of things that could actually expose us to PFAS. Do you think we can have alternative products to those things? Are there alternatives out there in the market that, without you, I don't expect you to start listing the alternatives, but is it possible to actually look out for alternatives?
Yes, it is. So the big example would be with cookware. I mean, you need to check with the suppliers and with the manufacturers, and it will often be on the labelling. But if you want non-stick cookware, ceramic non-stick cookware will usually not be made with PFAS. It's more to do with the way it's manufactured. Of course, it's much more expensive, and I wouldn't recommend someone throwing out all their cookware before the end of its life. But if you're getting to the point where the non-stick's breaking down, or you need to replace your cookware, then look at ceramic as an option, because chances are it's not been made with a PFAS.
I see. Interesting. Now, so if one is exposed, what health hazards or health risks are we looking at here?
Okay, well, without trying to worry people too much,
that's very key, because
it's very difficult, because a lot of this is down to there's different levels of exposure first. So day to day we are all exposed. Everyone is exposed to some extent, and we're looking at what would be called more like chronic sublethal effects. So it might be little changes and things, contributions towards various medical issues, rather than some sort of serious
health, like you're drinking an acid or something.
Exactly. So no acute effects, I would say. But there are links with problems with fetal development and other reproductive and fertility issues. So that's fairly well known. Cancers at certain levels, and endocrine disruption. So regulation of your hormones and various different ones. Those are the main effects that are fairly well known with PFAS. And it depends on which PFAS. And obviously with 15,000 of them, it's very difficult to know how potent one is versus another.
Now, there's this conversation about bioaccumulation, right? Because you're talking about the level of exposure. If bioaccumulation is a thing, which I'm sure you would help us explain what we mean by that, if you can. Does it then matter the level of exposure? Because if you're exposed to a tiny concentration over a long period of time, wouldn't that be a problem anyway?
Well, the way bioaccumulation works is like how we were talking before. The rate that the body can get rid of this one particular PFAS, is slower than the rate that it comes in. So it's difficult to break down, or it doesn't break down, which is the case. Our bodies just don't break them down. So it accumulates in the body. Now that doesn't mean that the dose is irrelevant, because you'd much rather have a smaller amount coming in than have regular high doses
at once.
So we have these half-lives, and the half-life is how long it takes if you were to have a single dose of one PFAS, how long it would take for your body to get the level of that PFAS down, or that dose down, to half of the original dose. And that can be months or years depending on which PFAS you've been exposed to. So a higher dose, so say you get twice as much, it would take the same amount of time to still get to half the amount. So a smaller dose is important. You want to minimise as much as possible.
As much as Wow, interesting. So, in terms of us trying to solve the problem, are you aware of any ongoing, say, global efforts or local efforts or research efforts that is currently helping to help us find a solution to the problem in the nearest or in the near future?
Yes, I mean, there are probably a lot of technologies out there that, if money was no option, would work perfectly well. But they use energy and time, and that's the problem, and these are costly. Now, there is a lot of work going on across the world to target various aspects, right, the sources of exposure. And I think water is the one where the most work is going on. So there's work being done with water filters. So different types of water filters to filter out your PFAS. Again, because there's so many with such wide-ranging physico-chemical properties, we call them. It's difficult to find a universal filter that you know is going to remove all the PFAS, but charcoal filters seem to be quite successful at being the most effective.
You mean just normal charcoal?
Pretty much, that's what they use. I mean, with all filters, you have to be very good at changing them before, at the right time.
That's the saturation point,
once you saturate them, it won't just not filter the PFAS out anymore, but it might actually start taking PFAS back out of the filter. There's, in British Columbia, I think they're doing some stuff on UV work, so ultraviolet rays, to break PFAS in drinking water down into fluoride. So the idea is then you've got a benefit, technically, if you believe that fluoride is a benefit for your teeth in the water. And then in terms of contaminated soil, which is also a big problem, there's work being done in Princeton University looking at microbial work, so using microorganisms to break down the PFAS using their processes, so like metabolic processes at a microbial level. And in Norway at NTNU, they've been looking at using sewage sludge. So sewage sludge tends to have PFAS in. So
loads of PFAS.
Yes. So when your wastewater, so this is all the water that comes from your house, whether it's from your sinks, your drains, your toilets, it goes through your sewage treatment plant. Most of the PFAS, when it goes through all the treatment processes, will end up in this solid element, the sludge that's filtered out of the water. So then they can do a process what's called pyrolysis, which turns this sludge into something called biochar, which is very effective at filtering PFAS out.
Oh, interesting.
So it could be an endpoint for PFAS. So there's work being done to look to see if that can be used to further treat sewage effluent.
And that would be a very useful one, because there's currently issue with what we do with the sludge at the end.
Exactly.
In some places it ends up in agricultural fields. Which then, with what we've said about the persistence of PFAS, these pollutants can actually end up in the plants that we end up eating.
Which means that sludge we know contains
loads of pollutants. Not just PFAS.
Not just PFAS, but a number of pollutants, flame retardants and other pollutants, and ends up going straight back into the environment, like you say, and into the food chain.
Most likely pollutes groundwater depending on how long it is left there.
So it's very cyclical. It's about, we need to find ways to break the cycle. So I think there's two main things.
Somewhere.
We need an end point for the PFAS to go that stops it from re-entering the environment, that fits with our circular economy that we want. And we need to actually stop the input at the source of PFAS into the environment.
Actually, that's going to nicely lead me into the next question I'm going to ask you, actually. So, why, we know these things can cause all of these problems, why can't we just go stop using it? That's too simple, right?
It's too simple. I think legislation historically hasn't always worked. So what we've seen with other POPs, other persistent organic pollutants, is that when one particular chemical gets banned, it's usually very specific to the chemical.
Yeah.
And another very similar chemical very quickly comes onto the market and replaces it. So we're always playing catch up. So legislation doesn't always work as quickly as we'd like it to. And so there's talk of this approach of grouping.
Okay.
To try and get around this and grouping chemicals as one and banning the groups. Now, the problem is all of this still takes time. There's processes and procedures in place, and then you will have lobbyists from the manufacturers, particularly if they're from large corporations who will have influence.
I'm sure big farmers would also have a hand in some of these conversations we're having. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then what happens is when things do get banned, there's often exemptions in place for 5, 10, 15 years for some of the core uses. And what that means is, although it's technically banned, sometimes it can be a use that's maybe 50 to 80 to 90% of the global production of that chemical for the next 5 to 10 years, means it carries on at a very similar rate to what it was before it's banned.
Yeah, and I think another dimension of the conversation would be, before you ban something, you must have alternatives, right? And then considering the wide application of PFAS containing products, what are you going to ban and what are you going to, and even if we ban, there's already more than enough in circulation for us to deal with. It's a bit like the microplastics problem, right?
Absolutely.
Where it's you hardly know where to start. But this is not to make people feel like there's no hope.
No, I think there is hope. It's going to be a very long process. I think even if you were able to immediately ban all PFAS now, it will take years, decades to make the world PFAS free.
Now, we've talked about global approach and governmental approach, regulations and all of that, but basically it comes down to individuals, right? And I think you've mentioned some of these things where you talked about non-stick products and all of that. Do you have any other list of products, not a very long list, just 1 or 2 products that you would say, okay, but again, what I'm trying to say basically is, what advice can you offer to individuals who listen to this and go, oh, what can I do to help myself? What advice can you find that line?
Well, there are some things. So companies are taking more responsibility now and are starting to offer PFAS-free products.
Alternatives.
So I think regardless of what kind of product we're talking about, there will often be labeling which will say PFAS free or fluorine free. Okay, if it's fluorine free, it cannot have PFAS in, right? And if it's PFAS free, it's PFAS free. So look for the labeling. You can research online as well. So for outdoor gear, for example, there's a number of brands now, well-known brands like Patagonia and others that will have waterproof outdoor gear that is PFAS free. Same for cookware. Same for some cosmetics as well, because cosmetics we haven't talked about, but that's quite a big one. Foundations and skincare and things like that. A lot of those will have PFAS in. There are some mainstream brands that are starting to go for PFAS free. Now, it's a very personal choice as to what people go for, but it's worth doing the research to look in there.
And sorry, you said foundation, right? There's been research about how dermal exposure, that how this PFAS can actually pass through the body into the skin, into the body.
Yeah.
Without, I don't know, because I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So there's some work that's been done here at the University of Birmingham as well, looking at what we would call the dermal uptake or the dermal absorption of PFAS.
Odney was part of that research team, wasn't she?
Yeah.
With chase her down.
Yeah, so her research, Odney's research has been recognised recently.
I see.
So she did some work under the supervision of Stuart Harrod and Mohammed Abdallah, looking at the uptake through skin of PFAS, and cosmetics was one of the things that they looked at, and one, how it can pass through the skin barrier, and then the next step of actually getting into the bloodstream and into the body. So there's bioaccessibility and then bioavailability. Yeah.
I see. Interesting. So, as a way of bringing it to a gradual close, are there any myths or misconceptions? Because, as it is with most of these pollutants, there's always something out there where people come up with all kinds of conspiracies and myths. Are there any myths that you would like to bust about PFAS?
There's probably, I'd say there's a couple of things to look at from both sides, really. So the first one I'd say is, we often get people say, however, these chemicals seem to be relatively safe based on maybe some EPA reports or a lack of evidence showing the opposite, that they're toxic, or very small levels of research which suggest safe limits. And I would be skeptical of those when such little research has been done at that point, because what we saw with two of the PFAS and PFOA is that as all the research was compiled and more work was done, actually in Europe they ended up having to reduce the safe limits for those two PFAS by factors of 10 and 100, I think it was, for how much you're exposed to. So I would be skeptical of people saying for relatively unstudied chemicals that they're safe.
They're safe.
On the other side, the other myth is that because some of the work we've done, we find it in the human body and we end up finding it in breast milk in women, which then is technically a source, or is a source of exposure to infants who are feeding. And it's important to say that this shouldn't discourage people from breastfeeding their children if that's the choice that they want to make. So sometimes you might see in the media, my breast milk is toxic or things like that. And I think it's important to understand that, yes, while we need to work to remove PFAS from the environment and from the body, it shouldn't stop you from breastfeeding.
Because, basic cost-benefit analysis, it's a simple way to go about that. The cost of not breastfeeding compared to whatever PFAS exposure.
Exactly. So
which is going to happen anyway.
The benefits that you get from breastfeeding for your child far outweigh. And the other thing is, if we look at breastfeeding as a relatively, although it's initially quite a high source of exposure for infants, it's relatively short term. Okay. So if you breastfeed for a year, it's a year of their life that they're having that sort of exposure. And as they grow and develop and get bigger, that source of exposure becomes more and more minor as their in terms of primary source of exposure. So when we're talking about chronic exposure, so long-term exposure to chemicals, that is a relatively short part of their life, so it's probably not as bad as people think.
There's this serious scare of eco-anxiety where some people are getting really anxious around. So I like ending most of these conversations on a very positive note, and it could be things about where we are in terms of research, just to show that yes, we're making progress. So I don't know, what positive wrap would you like to give to this PFAS conversation?
Well, I'd say probably the main thing is that you personally can do things that will help. And I think so you can actually contribute to improving the situation. But when I say that, I mean you can make choices for yourself about what to buy that reduces exposure for yourself, but also hopefully reduces demand for the products that do have PFAS in.
Yeah, because it's a cyclic, like you said, it's a cyclic thing, right? It just goes around and comes around.
Exactly, and with this sort of thing, we have had success with other chemicals in the past. About when people refuse to buy things, you look at supermarkets with plastics and containers.
Yeah.
If people feel strongly at an individual level, they can actually make those positive changes.
Yeah. Wow, thank you. Very, very interesting conversation. I'm sure you all enjoyed it. We'll follow up with more similar conversations. And if you have any questions you would like us to ask Dr. Dan, feel free to send them and leave comments down below. Thank you very much for watching.